Okay, so this I think is an interesting slide because it shows that most students in voucher schools are publicly funded. So when it started, the idea was, well, we'll take a few students in those struggling public schools and put them in some more successful private schools, and then, just sort of by osmosis, it will really help them. And there's a little bit to that theory, you change the environment of a child, you can really dramatically change outcomes. But that's not how the program works anymore. The majority of schools are well over 90% voucher students. And then I wonder if you are at 95, 98, 100% voucher students, are you a private school anymore? You are 100% publicly funded, but you don't have the same requirements as the public schools. And this is actually something I was going to do, but didn't have the time, is really enumerate all of the requirements that public schools have that private schools do not. So voucher schools.
What are those? Let's talk about them.
Yeah, so a couple of them are the Students with Disabilities Act, and that includes making sure that students have personal development plans. They are not secluded or restrained inappropriately, like left in a room. They're not secluded from other students inappropriately. They're integrated into the classroom as much as possible. They don't have the same regulations that public schools need to follow. If you're a special education teacher, those are significant, and rightfully so, because it is far too easy to abuse special education students. They can't advocate for themselves too often. So some people may say that those regulations are too rigorous, but I would say, well, they're there for a reason because these students have been taken advantage of.
Certified teachers?
Certified teachers. It's not necessary to have certified teachers in private schools, sorry, even if they are 100% publicly funded. It's not necessary to do criminal background checks on those teachers. It's not necessary to have clear procedures for expelling those students. They can simply be expelled. You don't need to have a hearing, which certainly leads to a syndrome called cherry picking. So we see far fewer students with emotional behavioral development disabilities.
What happens to the kids that do get expelled?
Yeah, so where do you think the students who get expelled go? Back to the public schools, yeah. And it's a little bit ironic, we sort of skimmed through those first slides talking about poverty and talking about race. Well, we all know that really truly the greatest concentrations, especially of race in Wisconsin, are in Milwaukee and Madison, our more urban public school areas, and Racine, Beloit, right? And ironically, Milwaukee is where we have had the voucher program, right? So when we see the highest percentages of students of minorities in failing schools, those are Milwaukee schools. But it's not just that Milwaukee has failing public schools, it's that there's a revolving door. So children are going into the private schools and into the public schools and into the private schools and into the public schools. And that's where we're really seeing kids falling through the cracks. When I got elected for public education. If you haven't gotten that from me yet, that is what I really worked on. And I just every opportunity I got to serve on an education committee or whatever, I just really worked on that. And the more I got into it, and the more I tried to understand funding, because, I was an English teacher. So the more I tried to really grasp this, the more I was like, I have to understand what's really happening with some of those voucher schools. I'm hearing all sorts of really interesting stories, but I just have to see this. And so I found two women from Milwaukee, and they sent us up on this really interesting little bus tour. I went with two journalists, and we toured 3 voucher schools. And it was incredible. So the first one was Hope Christian Academy. It's actually really well known. The governor likes to go and promote his education reform policies there. On the surface, there weren't things that were too terrible, but it was very rigid. The children did not actually have a cafeteria. They had to sit in their desks. They didn't really talk to each other. It was like PBIS on steroids, I like to say, if you understand education talk, right? And so they walked down the hall very well. And all the children were minority, and all the teachers were Caucasian. And the turnover from freshman to senior was, they estimated to us that it was maybe they retained about 60% of the students from when they entered the school as freshmen to when they graduated as seniors. Well, the biggest bragging point of this school is that every child is placed in a secondary school of education. So they're all accepted into a technical college or something. But that high turnover rate, and it was so rigid. I just really wonder what happened to the students who didn't fit into that system.
I think we know where they went.
Right. Then, the second school I went to was physically unsafe for young children. There were young children playing next to a busy 4-lane road with no physical barrier. And they were like, second, third grade. We went inside, it was unclean, there was no toilet paper, it was gross. We walked around, the principal had no education experience whatsoever and openly told us that. I saw a child being grabbed by their arm. I mean, this was definitely not legal in the public schools. And then we walked past the science classroom, and this kind of was the kicker for me, when the principal, who was really proud of what he was showing us and really kept saying, hey, but I've really improved it a lot. And I sadly really believe him, that he's actually really improved it. He said, oh, well, here's our science classroom. The school's been in operation for 7 years. We don't have any equipment yet. All the kids are learning science on YouTube. It seems to be working really well. And there was a child sitting at a table with a piece of paper and a pencil watching YouTube on a smartboard. I mean, it's just amazing. Science curriculum for an entire school. Now, these children could be K-12 in that school and only have exposure to science. And some of them probably for 7 years have only had exposure to science through YouTube. The other really disturbing thing is that there were a lot of children who were immigrating there because they were refugees. And of course, this hits close to me, right, with the Hmong population in Wausau. And they're refugees from Myanmar. And the principal said, hey, these kids are getting bullied in the public schools, so we find a safe place for them here, and we really welcome them. And I was like, well, that's really kind of you. Do you have any ELL teachers on staff? How many special education students do you have here? Well, 15% are diagnosed with IEPs, but we figure it's at least 30%. Do you have any special education teachers? And then the last school I went to, so these, by the way, are all 100% publicly funded because they all have 100% voucher schools. The last school I went to, I could tell you more stories, but basically, I went into a classroom and I was like, this is incredible. You have such small class sizes. How do you do this for your school? There's only 6 or 8 kids in a room. This must be really fun to teach in. Oh, Mandy, it's that time of the year. The kids don't really come anymore anyway. That was April. So I was in Milwaukee, in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Wisconsin, where if you read the newspaper, you'll see that children get shot in the playground sometimes, and there's drugs, and there's all sorts of things happening, and I don't mean to demonize those communities, but we're not even keeping those children safe. We don't even have them in the desk. We don't even have basic attendance requirements, and they're 100% publicly funded, and that system is destroying public education in Wisconsin.